Welcome to History Comes Alive, the podcast that takes you on a deep dive into a new historical topic every episode. Join us as we explore the nuances of historical events you probably didn't learn about in school. Here's your host, Jeff Nichols.
Welcome back. We've come a long way down the road toward the Pequot War. The times of threatening rhetoric and untenable demands on the part of the English toward the Pequots had come to an end. The magistrates of Massachusetts Bay had moved away from talking to the Pequots. First, they tried to employ scare and intimidation tactics. Then they made a play for non-Pequot native support. Their primary focus was the Narragansetts, another regional powerhouse that also happened to be traditional enemies of the Pequot. That endeavor had paid off. The Pequots were not just working on diplomacy, they were taking action. And we closed last time in part with this, quote, "The English had secured a major ally. They had secured the geography of Boston and Plymouth by virtue of the Narragansett Pledge. There were real native supporters of anyone warring with the Pequots, and they are worth developing." There was still much to come. Connecticut was on fire. The Pequots had not been spending their time on diplomacy, and they would not spend their time on diplomacy throughout the coming winter. The might of the Pequot was going to be felt by Englishmen all throughout the Connecticut settlements. Those actions are worth looking at. End quote. Both the cast of native characters and the violence that erupted in the winter of 1636 and 37 are stories that we'll continue to work through this week. Now, just one side note, as I look at that quote from last week, the Pequots did take a shot at diplomacy, if you'll remember, but the diplomatic efforts of Roger Williams had them vanquished from the Narragansett village. And it was after this, late summer, early fall, 1636, that they resorted to only violence and terror. But it had already begun. As their diplomatic envoys tried to win the support of the Narragansetts, their warriors were already busy on the Connecticut frontier. So diplomacy was one of the immediate actions taken by Saussicus when the reality of what lay ahead had sunk in, war with the English. That effort took place on the Narragansett Bay. Meanwhile, back at Saybrook, which we'll consider ground zero, Lyon Gardner had a lot of work ahead of him. Now, the term meanwhile back at Saybrook, has several applications for our time together today. It means that while all of the diplomacy was taking place, and again, you remember Roger Williams had helped to pave that way, and then his diplomacy, his efforts were continued by Edward Johnson, and then Roger Williams again intervened, and then lastly, the magistrates of Boston, led at this point still by Governor Vane, closed the deal with Miantonomo. But it can also be understood as while the Pequots were trying to garner their own support. So meanwhile, at the same time, remember, we want to understand this narrative as a series of transparencies. So we'd place the next 2 or 3 episodes right on top of the last 2, same time frame. It would not be long before the Pequots would come to understand that they would soon have to fight the English and the Narragansetts at the same time. Those are tough times. They were already facing disunity, civil war, lost leadership, plague. Imagine the psyche on these guys at this point. I mean, the situation seems like it could have been maddening. One thing they still failed to realize was that the coming war was going to be fought European style, not Algonquin. As Leo Bonfanti put it, they believed the war would consist of, quote, sporadic raids against their well-fortified villages. Both sides would suffer a few casualties, and the peace treaty would be effected when both sides found the inevitable stalemate either intolerable or boring, end quote. Based on this assessment, they made the decision to move forward with hostilities and not sue for peace. Ultimately, they would attack multiple settlements along the Connecticut River. They concentrated 300 soldiers for the harassment of Saybrook Fort alone. As I said, meanwhile, back at Saybrook. So it's against that backdrop that we can begin our narrative of the winter of 1636 and 37 with the beginning of Pequot hostilities, the siege and the Battle of Saybrook Fort. Now, this siege began in September of 1636 and would continue for the next 8 months until March of 1637. In those 8 months of the siege, there were 20 dead and wounded, Terror Algonquin style, not English. I mean, it was not total war from the Pequot, point of view, because if it had been, all of the English in Connecticut would have perished. That was the style that the English would soon bring, total annihilation. The casualties were not the only Pequot accomplishments. In the process, they caused terror and disruption. They destroyed provisions in storehouses, and they disrupted river trade and travel to Windsor, Wethersfield, and Hartford. Over the next couple of episodes, we'll work through the Pequot activities throughout that winter. Saybrook was the epicenter, but all the settlements and towns would feel the effect of the John Endicott mission. This was a time when the settlements of Connecticut were in a holding pattern of defensive tactics, not offensive. Many of the folks we'll find were sitting ducks. Both sides learned a lot about each other during this winter, and the battle or the massacre at Mystic was still 10 months away. So let's start with the immediate activity of Lyon Gardner. He was not just the military guy at this point. With the abandonment of John Winthrop Jr., Gardner was now the administrative leader as well. There was a lot riding on him. He had a lot of things to tend to. Not just the business of Saybrook, but he had an extra motivation in his young wife and their newborn baby. Lyon Gardner wasted little time trying to protect what he had in corn. That was one of his concerns, if you remember, about provoking the Pequots, food. When I first read this, it made perfect sense. I mean, I envisioned a corn crop growing almost in the shadow of the palisade of Saybrook. That's not the image at all, though. That's not the reality. The corn to be harvested was 2 miles away from the fort. They traveled there by land. Imagine the work that took to get all of the necessary tools, supplies, and equipment just to go that 2 miles into the crops in a hostile land. It took nearly half the available men of Saybrook to make that trip. It would seem that everybody was vulnerable. I mean, it's not like Saybrook had hundreds of soldiers living there. They couldn't afford to lose any men. Every decision Gardner made had to factor the shortage of bodies. So he divides what few men he has into 2 groups, and they go their separate ways for a while. They did manage to harvest the corn without incident, and they stored it in a stronghouse that was built nearby, wisely, in advance for a time such as this. Although they had walked to the crop, they would send a shallop to pick up the corn and transport it back to Saybrook. The stronghouse was not safe without guards, so he left 5 men to guard the corn until the shallop could return for it the next day. It seems like a smart move to have left the shallop for the first part of this activity. I mean, how many men were there? I don't know. How many shallops would they have needed to transport the men and the corn? What if the whole trip had gone bad? I mean, the shallops would be needed by those that were left at Saybrook, right? So Gardner was thinking like a leader and making the tough decisions that may have led to more work, but also had the best possibility of success. I know I would much rather have been on a boat in the middle of the river as I traveled, as opposed to walking through the fields at this point. So anyways, he left 5 guys with just one job: guard the corn. Stay in the stronghouse with your guns, pay attention, and we'll be back tomorrow and pick you up. Stay put. Guess what? They did not do their one job. They did not stay put. These guys apparently did not get the memo at just how precarious their situation was. I mean, maybe they were just stupid. The gravity of the situation seems like it would have been obvious. I mean, it should have gone without saying, right? But Alfred Cave relates an account of what happened next. Not long after Gardner and the others left, 3 of the guys that were left behind decided to go duck hunting. Now, they didn't just go duck hunting. Almost like the visual of harvesting the corn right outside the walls of Saybrook and learning that the corn was 2 miles away, the hunters traveled about a mile from the safe house. And I wonder what the conversation was like before they left. I mean, was this a consensual hunting trip? You know, did they think that they needed the food? I mean, was this an attempt to bolster the general food supply at Saybrook? Were they all in agreement that this was a wise or necessary course of action? I mean, did they argue? Did they draw straws to see who would go or who would stay? Did some of the guys just simply refuse to go? I mean, I don't know. It seems like a dumb idea, a dangerous idea. And it was. As they walked further and further from the safety of the stronghouse, Their path led them through tall grass. And you can already see where this is going, right? I mean, I remember when I was young, we would play in tall grass sometimes. I have a picture in my mind of what this could look like. We would hide on each other. We'd play hide and seek or ghost in the graveyard or war. It could be surprisingly easy to conceal yourself just a few feet away from your friends, lying quiet and still. You could get so caught up in the game, the task at hand of being quiet and still, that I still remember you could easily get spooked. It could get a little creepy, even knowing you were just playing a game. What was the overall experience here? I mean, what was their walk like? Did they gain confidence the further they traveled? I mean, they must have been quiet as they walked. I mean, they were hunting. But were they jumpy or nervous? Did they realize the potential danger? Either way, they were being watched, followed. In the tall grass were hidden 100 very patient Pequot warriors. You know, there's a skill to remaining unseen, going unnoticed. There are 100 little things that can cause a well-hidden person to expose themselves. I mean, these are skills that the best of the best train tirelessly to gain. Here we had 100 Pequots all remaining silent and still. I wonder, was it hot? Did their legs cramp? Were there bugs? I mean, at some point, did the situation and the larger situation that they were facing get to the best of them? Did anybody laugh? What was that like? How big was the field? How close did the hunting party get to these natives? Again, when I was younger, when we played, there were a few deep ditches with overhangs of thick grass. And I'm thinking of specific places where we played right now. I used to slip under those overhangs and watch as my friends would sneak quietly past, looking for me. The weeds were so thick, if I was quiet, they'd never find me. No doubt there were times when I missed them as well. I mean, sometimes you'd brag later, but sometimes you left that success alone and did not tell anybody about it, saving that special spot for another time. Tree roots from a large fallen tree near a creek worked equally as well to conceal ourselves, especially the big willows. So anyways, I wonder what the situation was here. How high was the grass? How thick was it? Were there footpaths? I mean, you know, when you're walking through the grassy fields sometimes, you leave a path behind that's real noticeable for a while. Were there wind mazes? Maybe they hadn't noticed the grass being ruffled. I mean, how big a field are we talking? It was smart to hide. The issue was not if they defeat the English hunters. The issue was to take them while avoiding casualties. I mean, the English had guns. Why risk even a few guys if you can exercise patience and get them all without losing any? So the hunt was a success. On the way back, however, the Pequots attacked. They must have been there a long time, lying still, waiting. The hunters must have had their guard down a little bit. What a contrast between the still patient Pequots and the wayward Englishmen. It seems like an overhead shot from a drone would be a cool video of this. I mean, the still, motionless bodies of the natives while the English walk harrowingly close, unaware. It seems like they would have been more careful. I mean, they had shot their guns, right? Might as well light a fire at night and just tell everybody where you're at. They had given their position away. The Pequots did not want to risk the loss of warriors by attacking the stronghouse directly. The English inside had guns. There might not be very many of them, but they had guns, right? But these guys, unaware, were vulnerable. Maybe these guys doubted the risk. Maybe they had thought there was a risk and then decided maybe there wasn't so much of a risk. Maybe they thought Lion Gardner was just being paranoid. Because let's think about the day that they had had. They had walked the 2 miles safely, didn't see any natives. They had harvested the corn safely, didn't see any natives. They had walked at least a mile one way on this hunt, fired their guns, killed ducks safely, didn't see any natives. Even that, when they fired their guns at the ducks, I wonder, did they rotate their shots so that somebody always had a loaded gun? I mean, just in case, as you're firing out in the middle of nowhere and announcing to the whole world exactly where you are. Anyways, I know when I was younger, we used to do crazy things. Everybody does when they're younger, and you kind of have this sense of invincibility And the farther down the path you go towards any one of these dangerous or stupid activities, the longer you get away with it, the more careless you become. Like it just becomes not that big a deal, right? That's that shock value seems to go away, the sense of urgency or the danger until it presents itself. So they're walking back. They've shot a lot of ducks, pretty successful hunt. And the 100 warriors were very close by. I mean, you could imagine this scene with the Pequots suddenly rising up from a distance and charging the surprised men, right? Arrows flying through the air, maybe tomahawks and knives, I don't know. But these guys were closer than that. Like, in my mind, based on the details to come, gauntlet close, as in an aisle or a line of natives to work through. Like the closeness of when I was young, they did not have some big distance to fill between themselves and their prey. When the Pequots attacked, 2 of the 3 men were captured immediately. Their guns were no help. They were too long for the close-quartered fighting that ensued. Again, that's close range. You don't even have time to raise your gun and fire. And they had not even seen the natives. 100 natives, which all remained hidden and unseen as they walked so close that their guns couldn't be raised and fired once the attack began. The one guy that did manage to break through and get back to the stronghouse did so by yielding his sword. He cut and hacked his way through the natives. I mean, he must have run fast. Either that or they didn't pursue him either. Then I'm like, is he walking around with these guys just with his sword in his hand? Because if they didn't have time to raise their guns, how could he have pulled his sword? Maybe he was hacking the tall grass. I don't know. But at any rate, the only guy that got away was the guy that relied on his sword and not his gun. And if that does nothing else, it demonstrates just how close, just how well hidden, and just how still the Pequot were to these men. And I'm surprised when he got back to the stronghouse, probably yelling and screaming, I'm surprised they opened the door at all. I mean, if I was there, I may have been tempted to keep the door closed and locked. And I would have had a good rationale, later in my own defense. I mean, I could have said, I had to protect the corn for the entire Saybrook community's well-being. I mean, that's my excuse anyways, right? So the other 2 were caught and tortured to death within earshot of the stronghouse. Imagine that nightmare. What kinds of sounds do you think they heard? I mean, we don't have a description of the torture of this account, or at least I don't. But there will be other accounts that we explore later that will, and their descriptions later will suffice when we get to them. Just know that the torture of some of these men was horrendous. It's on par with the brutality of European quartering and the pouring of hot liquids in orifices that may be a natural part of one's biology or synthetic, if you know what I mean. The sounds must have been awful, terrifying, but made worse when you knew these guys, when they were so close. I mean, suddenly, I get the feeling these men had their come to Jesus moment, and the reality of the situation they were in, not just here in the stronghouse, but the larger situation at Saybrook, must have really sunk in. It sucks to learn the seriousness of an offense at the consequence stage. I hate that. The shallop arrived as expected, and the remaining men darted from the stronghouse to the safety of the shallop, which quickly left the shoreline for the safety of deeper water. They left the corn, obviously. What kind of fate had they avoided? I mean, what if the shallop hadn't come? What if it had been delayed? What if the shallop had been attacked? Did these guys escape a torturous death or starvation, dehydration, fire? I vote fire. Because it wasn't long after the shallop pulled away, mere moments, that they saw the thick black smoke rising into the air. The stronghouse had been torched. My guess, and that's all this is that they escaped that fate by mere minutes. I mean, I could be wrong, but I'm thinking these Pequots were not looking to let them live, and they weren't looking to charge the stronghouse and try to force their way in. But the ordeal was not over. The Pequots followed and taunted the boat all the way back to Saybrook. They set a haystack on fire, quote, within bowshot of the fort itself, end quote. They butchered a cow, and there were many more in the coming days that wandered back into the fort with arrows sticking out of their hides. Now, you might not think that sounds like too bad a situation from the safety of Saybrook, but think about the message that those actions send. We can do whatever we want, wherever we want, and there's nothing you can do about it. You're in a small fort, isolated from Englishmen, and surrounded by hundreds of Pequots. Again, 300 warriors were assigned just to the harassment of Saybrook. That's not a fun place to be. I would imagine that Lyon Gardner wanted to just about strangle John Endicott about now. Maybe he'd have wanted to strangle all the magistrates of Massachusetts Bay at this point, especially when you consider that although they were kind of running the show over here just by sheer numbers and belligerence, Lyon Gardner was a hired military man for wealthy investors back in England. He was subject to their whims, but he was not a Massachusetts Bay Puritan settler assigned to Saybrook by their magistrates. That would be infuriating, suffering the consequences of administrators far away, who will never have to live with the consequences of their own bad decisions. Who, in fact, as we've seen, merely cover their own tracks when the situation warrants it, through denial, finger-pointing, fudging, or losing official records. I am so glad that we've made such progress in that area. So, at any rate, the same day as the Saybrook men were attacked by the Pequots, another settler worried about his own crop. Matthew Mitchell, one of the original founders of Saybrook, now a trader out of Wethersfield, requested a shallop from Gardner to harvest his crop. The plan was to send 5 guys to do the job. Not Saybrook guys, his guys, servants. When you think about it, that would suck. I mean, they had nothing to say about the danger that he was going to put them in. Now, some accounts list Mitchell possibly as one of the 5 guys, but he wasn't, as we'll soon see. Mitchell, at this point, I believe, was working with William Pynchon, the trader that had a warehouse in Saybrook, and you remember him, had originally been the countervoice to all of the paranoia about the Pequots. Remember, he had advised Lyon Gardner to not believe everything he heard. He said he hadn't seen any activity among the Pequots that seemed like they had any intention of being aggressive toward the English or Saybrook. And as you recall, in our own look at this narrative, they did not appear to be planning anything. Even after the Saybrook Conference, when the Massachusetts Bay delegation had threatened them and gone away, they still tried to trade with Saybrook. They tried, that is, until John Endicott ran roughshod through several villages of both the Pequots and the Western Nyanticks. Now, the air had certainly changed at this point. Mitchell knew trouble was coming, enough to gamble an early harvest. His crop was located on 6 Mile Island. It was probably corn. One source said it was hay. Either way, Mitchell, like Gardner, wanted to protect his investment. Well, Gardner refused the shallop at first. I mean, it was dangerous. His job was to protect the interest of Saybrook Fort and the English settlers in the area. His objection is very understandable. He knew it was going to get really bad. When you think about it, it might have been during this very discussion, this argument he's having with Mitchell, that his men, just a couple of miles away, were under attack. But Mitchell persisted, and I would have too. I mean, I can definitely see both sides of this. He's got investments. He's got things he's got to worry about. Ultimately, Lyon Gardner would oblige Mitchell's request, but he did have some instructions for him. And just as a side note, this is not the first and only argument we'll see Lyon Gardner have with another one of these settlers. At any rate, Gardner gave him some instructions. He didn't think the 5 guys was enough. If they did go, he told Mitchell, that of the 5 guys, 4 should harvest, while the other kept watch. And he also suggested an additional 2 guys should be stationed at, quote, the foot of the rock, end quote. Now, I'm assuming, I saw that quote, Alfred Cave has that quote in his book, and I'm assuming that the rock was a reference to an obvious, specific rock that everybody was familiar with. So he wanted him to place 2 guys at the foot of the rock to make sure that the natives did not run down on them. And further, Mitchell was instructed to check the fields with dogs to make sure they were clear of natives. That's a great way to make sure there's nobody hiding on you. I'm guessing the tall grass then has been an issue a few times already for these guys. I mean, remember, this conversation took place before the first group had returned. So he was well aware of the danger of tall grass. Like Miles Standish at Plymouth, this is where Lyon Gardner earned his keep. He thought like a soldier. He was able to recognize the danger that would come even before Massachusetts Bay instigated anything. And now he was making decisions as if there had already been trouble. I mean, sometimes you need an administrator or a bureaucrat. Sometimes you need a diplomat. and sometimes you need a soldier. You need people who can organize a society or a group once the area has been secured. You need people who can reach out to others and have frank, difficult discussions. People who can form a consensus with others. You need the guys that clear the way initially and then keep that way clear when trouble comes. The administrator, or the bureaucrat, the diplomat, the social apologist, and the soldier, he who provides and keeps security. Now, most people, even successful people, those that thrive in an environment that was created for them. Most of us act much more in an administrative or a diplomatic role than the role of a soldier. I've noticed that oftentimes these guys create problems because they fail to understand on a very fundamental level that they are operating in an environment that somebody else provided, that somebody else maintains for them, keeps them safe and secure as they go about their business. And trouble starts when they fail to basically stay in their lane. Money, the opportunity to build wealth, can be a great inducement to administrative overreach. Here in the Connecticut frontier at Saybrook Fort, a soldier, the guy who clears and provides the way, was hard at work trying to keep the way clear in the aftermath of faraway administrators pushing an agenda whose motivation was money, when diplomacy had broken down. And as usual, who's the guy taking the criticism for employing the necessary steps for everybody's safety? Lion Gardner, the soldier. Do the dirty work, people will say. Now go away. Which of the three personalities do you most identify with? I mean, as you look at a situation like this, can you see the outline of these different character traits, these different positions or responsibilities that each one of these characters plays? In Mitchell's defense, I think he was aware of the danger, but was also trying to protect his investment, just as Saybrook Fort was when they sent their guys to harvest their corn. One commentator said Gardner relented when he realized or felt that Mitchell did not care about the danger. Maybe. But I think he was driven by that sense of need and preparation that one feels when they sense a storm is coming. And that sense of urgency can propel a person to action that they may not ordinarily take, risks they may not ordinarily take. I picture this like the news footage of coastal areas in the United States here, when the public realizes that they are indeed in the path of a hurricane. They move pretty quick to secure their belongings. That's what Gardner had done for the interests of Saybrook and its residents, and that's what Mitchell was probably trying to do. So they had the shallop and some men and wise instruction, but they only sent 5 guys, not 7. Those 5 guys ignored Gardner's advice. They did not check the fields for natives. They did not post any guards or lookouts. They just got to work. Now, maybe they were just trying to hurry, gather the crops before the storm. But if you'll notice, there's a pattern here, and there's a pattern oftentimes in our own lives. The guy that you hired to be the expert is giving you the expert's advice, and they simply ignored it. They had the job of gathering the crop, yes, but the added instruction of placing guards, that's there for a reason. So at any rate, they just have their heads down, they're pushing forward, they're moving quickly to perform the task at hand, and they weren't paying attention. They didn't even see the natives rising again out of the tall grass until it was too late, just like the previous group. And of this, Lion Gardner himself would later write, quote, "The Indians presently rose out of the grass and killed 3. The Pequots roasted the 4th captive alive," end quote. As for the 5th guy, Gardner recorded his fate as well. Quote, "The other," he said, "came down drowned to us, with an arrow shot into his eye through his head," end quote. That was in a letter from Lion Gardner to John Winthrop that was dated November 6th, 1636. Now, as a disclaimer, there was at least one account that reported only one guy died here, burned at the stake by the Pequots. But these records of these times can often get blurry. We've talked about that before. The events can get mixed up a bit in the memory or the recollections of those that were there. But other sources quoted from Lion Gardner directly on this. And he, like John Underhill, I believe is pretty reliable. His place in this story, it's not like he's perfect, right? But his place specifically in this story, His objectives and his track record here indicate that he had an honest assessment, that what he offered was probably the truth. Similar to John Underhill, he made no apologies for these things in that way. Politicians, administrators, diplomats, they make apologies. These guys are soldiers. So it was September of 1636, and it would be a long fall and winter for the folks at Saybrook Fort. The Pequot aggression and the Reign of Terror had just begun. There would be a lot more. Although Saybrook would be the epicenter, everybody would feel the wrath. The attack on Saybrook here in September of 1636 represents the left bookend, if you will. The terror would culminate months later at Wethersfield, the right bookend. It would be that attack that would truly ignite the most furious fighting of the war. But those are stories for another day. And until then, I hope our time together today has really helped the history to come alive.
Thanks for listening to History Comes Alive. We hope today's episode has given you valuable new information and inspired you to dive even deeper. Don't forget to check out Jeff's website, historywithjeff.com, and engage with Jeff across all your favorite social media platforms at History with Jeff. Join us next time as more history comes alive.